and welcome to video 2 of lesson 12, the skeletal muscle system. And we're going to be talking about how skeletal muscles contract in this video. So far we've talked about the microscopic anatomy of the skeletal muscle, and we're going to continue on with that. One really important thing to know about skeletal muscles, it contains something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is a very specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum only found in muscle, and it surrounds each myofibril, and you can really see this as you look in this picture. All this blue is this sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's surrounding each one of these myofibrils. And then if you remember from the last video, these myofibrils will contain all of those sarcomeres on them, which ultimately are going to cause contraction. And the really important thing about this sarcoplasmic reticulum to know is that it stores calcium. You have to have two things really for muscle contraction. One is sodium, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and the other is calcium. Calcium is ultimately going to cause actin and myosin, those two proteins, to be able to come together and cause contraction to happen. So you must have a lot of calcium in skeletal muscle. That is why you have this specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum to store that calcium. So now we're going to talk about how this calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and how actin and myosin cause that muscle contraction. The first thing you need to know is skeletal muscle and other types of muscles are really unique because they are excitable, meaning that they're going to respond to a stimulus. They're able to shorten when stimulated. They're able to stretch, and they're able to go back to their resting length after being stretched. These are really important when looking at the ability to contract and keep doing that throughout one's life. So now we are going to talk about how nerves stimulate skeletal muscle. And this is actually pretty interesting, and it's really nice because it gives you a little bit of an intro to the nervous system for your next course. So nerves have to stimulate muscle to contract. You have to have a stimulus in order to contract. And the type of neuron that's going to stimulate a muscle cell is called a motor neuron. Okay, you think of like motor movement and motor skills. A motor neuron is going to cause the stimulation of a muscle cell. And a motor unit is the one neuron. This is a neuron here, and all of the muscle cells that it's going to stimulate. So let's first talk a little bit about what this neuron looks like. So the neuron has an axon, which is a long, basically thread-like extension of the neuron. And this axon will go and innervate the skeletal muscle cell. It branches into hundreds to thousands of these little axon terminals. And these axon terminals are going to form a junction with the sarcolemma of your muscle cell. Remember, the sarcolemma is your specialized plasma membrane of your muscle cell. So where this axon terminal and sarcolemma meet is referred to as a neuromuscular junction. Neuro for neuron, muscular for muscle, junction is where they meet. So this is where the neuron and the muscle meet. And something that's kind of interesting is they don't actually touch. They get very close to touching, but there's a microscopic little gap in between them called the synaptic cleft. So let's go ahead and take a look here at the neuromuscular junction. So this is your neuron here, and you can see it comes and it branches off into all of these little bulbs. And these bulbs are the axon terminals. And these axon terminals are what's going to innervate this muscle here. And as we zoom in, we can really see how cool this neuromuscular junction is. So here's your axon terminal here. Here's your muscle here. You can actually see here's a Z disc and here's a Z disc, so that's one sarcomere. Here's your actin, here's your myosin, and this is your sarcolemma right here, okay? So sarcolemma of your muscle, here is your axon terminal of the neuron, and then you can see this microscopic little gap in between them, and that is called the synaptic cleft. So what actually happens here? How does this all work? So what happens is your neuron is going to release what's called a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that's going to just cause something to happen. And there's a very specific neurotransmitter used for muscle contraction called acetylcholine, or ACH for sure. So if you look over here, here's your neuron, your axon terminal. You can see all these little bubbles in here. Those are vesicles filled with the acetylcholine. And what happens is when we want a contraction to start, the axon terminal releases these vesicles out into the synaptic cleft. So we basically have all this acetylcholine now going into the synaptic cleft, and it's gonna bind with these little receptors here on your sarcolemma of the muscle. So once the acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft, it's going to bind to that muscle cell. What happens is sodium is then going to rush in to the cell. So sodium is going to rush into your muscle cell. And we're going to have a little bit of potassium leak out of the cell. But what happens is we have all of this sodium rush in, like a ton of sodium rush in. And what I want you to look at is this charge right here. That's a positive charge. So when you have all of these sodium ions rushing into the cell, you have all of these positive charges going in at once. And what happens is this now causes the entire cell to have a positive charge. It actually changes the charge of the entire cell. And this is what's going to start your muscle contraction. So once this positive charge is up and going, it creates this electrical current. And we call this electrical current the action potential. Once your muscle cell has enough charge to it, there is no turning back, and a muscle contraction is going to occur. So once you reach the point of an action potential happening, it's going to happen. And we have to keep doing this to get more and more charges and more contractions. So you constantly need nerve impulses to be traveling to the muscle in order for it to keep contracting. Once we're done and we don't want to contract anymore, we take the sodium out of the cell and we allow the little bit of sodium to go back into the cell. And that's through a very special protein called the sodium-potassium pump. So what we're looking at here is actually the charge, and I wanted to just show you that once we have enough sodium rushing in, see it says sodium channels are opening. Once we have enough sodiums rush in, we're going to create what's called the action potential. And then once we're done, we take the sodium out of the cell and we put the potassium back in. And how we restore that is by the sodium-potassium pump. So here's all our sodium. This would be the inside of our muscle, and this is the outside of our muscle. Once we want contraction to be complete, we pump out the sodium, and then we pump in the potassium. But notice we're pumping out 3 sodiums, and we're pumping in 2 potassiums. So we're creating a more negative charge, or a positive charge, on the outside of the cell than the inside of the cell, because we're bringing more positives to the outside. All right, so we just talked about sodium rushing into the muscle cell. We're ready to start a contraction. Remember in my last video, I said that you need really 2 things to cause muscle contraction to occur. You need sodium and you need calcium. This is where calcium comes into play. So once you have enough sodium rush into the cell and you create that action potential, it's gonna cause the release of calcium from your sarcolemma. You actually have what are called T-tubules that kind of go all through down the myofibrils and then spread out, releasing calcium into it. So we release calcium from the T-tubules and it goes into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And now we have calcium entering into the muscle cell, the muscle fiber. So why do we need calcium? Well, actin and myosin are eventually going to attach. And when they attach, that's what's going to cause muscle contraction to occur. But you have to have calcium present for actin and myosin to be able to come together and create a cross bridge. So once calcium binds to actin, this is going to allow myosin to then attach to your actin protein. Once they attach, something called the power stroke is going to occur. The myosin head will actually pivot and pull the two actin filaments close together. And this is what's going to cause that H zone to become smaller and smaller. Once the power stroke occurs, the cross bridge is going to detach, and then you're going to have a new ATP bind. So let's look at this step by step. So here we go. We have calcium binding to actin, which then allows actin and myosin to come together and create the cross bridge. The power stroke then occurs where the myosin head cocks and pushes the actin filaments closer together. There you go. You can see the arrow showing that right there. This causes ADP and inorganic phosphate to be released. Once a new ATP molecule comes and binds to the myosin head, it will detach from the actin molecule. The myosin then uses that ATP, breaking it down into ADP and inorganic phosphate so that it can attach again to your actin filament. And this keeps going until we no longer want to move the actin filaments closer together. This is just another representation of what we just talked about. I just wanted to show it again. But the real big thing to understand here is that the thin filaments, those actin filaments, are coming closer together because these myosin heads are attaching to it and kind of forcing them together by that power stroke. So, once we want to stop muscle contraction, we basically take the calcium and push it back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This causes the muscle cell to relax and go back to normal length. And I really want you to look at these pictures A and B right here. This is a relaxed sarcomere. So the blue represents your actin and the red represents your myosin. So what happens here is you can see when we have that power stroke happen, the actin moves closer together, causing this H zone to become shorter. They're moving towards that M line. And it can happen so much that the actin filaments will actually start to slide past each other so that the H zone is completely gone. So this is a contracted sarcomere, this is a relaxed sarcomere. And you can see in the contracted one that the two actin filaments have now slid past each other because the myosin has attached and created that cross bridge and power stroke. All right, so we're going to stop there for this video. That was the complete process of muscle contraction. We're going to get into different types of contraction next and where we get the energy for muscle contraction. So go ahead, keep filling in your notes and start watching video 3.